Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we're going to examine the soul or the whole being of man in the brain and nervous system. With me is Dr. Oliver Sacks, a professor of neurology at the Albert Einstein School of Medicine and author of several books including Awakenings, A Leg to Stand On, and The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. Welcome, Oliver.
Nice to be here.
It's a pleasure to be with you. You know, in your writings, you describe people who might normally or conventionally be thought of as defective, people who can't perceive or who can't think normally, who cannot control their muscles the way normal people do. And as you look at them and deeply, you suggest that really there's something in their being that compensates, that in a sense very little is lost when one gets to know these people.
Well, a great deal can be lost, but a great deal can be recouped as well. And as you say, my tales are tales of loss, but they're always tales of adaptation and compensation, although those words are often much too mild. One almost wants a word like transcendence. But they're tales of resilience. And I think it's immensely reassuring to know that people who can be so devastated in some ways can still be fully human and fully active in others.
Mm-hmm. One gets the sense from your descriptions that as we live our conventional lives within what we think of as a normal, healthy being, that it's really a very narrow range of abilities. You describe, for example, a man who discovered for a period of a few weeks the ability to smell like a dog, and he entered into a whole new world of smells and there's so many worlds like these that are available to people.
Incidentally, that particular story, which was the last one in the Hat book, I should say, was written in San Francisco and was stimulated by the smell of eucalyptus here. I often find that I need some sort of some chance happening to remind me of a clinical event. That was especially interesting because this was a young medical student who had been experimenting with speed, amphetamines, and he rather suddenly went into a strange state in which he found his sense of smell immensely increased, and he found he could recognize everybody he knew by smell, that he could find his way around New York by smell, and he found himself in a world of smell, which is tremendously evocative and immediate.
Every street and every building had a different smell.
And this lasted for about 3 weeks, and then disappeared. When it occurred, life seemed tremendously real and immediate and sort of concrete, and he felt rather like a dog. When all this, and it was difficult for him to think abstractly because of the pressure of the concrete, because of smells calling to him, pressing on him all the while. Then when it went away, he sort of felt a mixed sense of regret and relief. But certainly one of the interesting things is this: he couldn't have had this had it not been latent in him. And if this power of smell was latent in him, it's probably latent in everybody. The sense of smell is probably repressed or suppressed in all of us. Freud thought this was so, perhaps partly on the basis of assuming an upright posture, perhaps on the basis of repressing some of the smells associated with pregenital sexuality. Anyhow, whatever the explanation is, as civilized adults, so-called, we don't seem to smell nearly as well as children, as animals, and as savages. and perhaps we've renounced some of our sense of smell. I don't know whether whether it's worth it or not. There's a wonderful novel called Perfume, which is an extraordinary imagination of a sort of olfactory genius, a sort of Mozart of the nose, whose whole world is smell. But yes, in general, I feel this very much from some patients and subjects I'm working with now who have a thing called Tourette's syndrome. I think that, as it were, allowed adult human nature is considerably smaller and more routinized than it might be.
The Tourette's syndrome, this is where people have nervous tics.
Yeah, there tend to be sudden violent movements and tics and impulses and exclamations and vocalizations.
And it's often associated, or maybe associated, with great bursts of creativity.
Well, it can go with it. In general, the mind is swifter. Associations can be accelerated. Things can be noticed at great speed. Sometimes one has the feeling of people with Tourette's syndrome moving and fast forward. The question is then really whether they can hold together and whether they can integrate themselves and compose anything else under such a pressure of impulse. It can tear them apart, but it can also sort of, I think, dispose to unusual achievement athletically, artistically.
You write of one episode, I think it may have lasted less than 2 minutes, and as I recall, you say that you learned more, it moved you more than perhaps any other 2-minute period in your entire life, when in the streets of New York, I believe, you witnessed a woman who had this syndrome.
Yeah, she was impersonating. Impersonating sounds too conscious and too deliberate. There was a sort of convulsive taking on of the movements and the repertoires, the voices, the faces of everyone who passed her. And this was done within a few seconds, so that about 50 of these were done within 2 or 3 minutes. And then obviously the pressure of all this was too much for her, and she turned aside, she turned into a little alley, and had a sort of ingurgitation, a sort of vomiting out at high speed of the faces and the personae of these people whom she'd sort of incorporated. I think that one often, the clinic itself and the usual conditions of medical observation, I think, can limit what one sees, and especially for something like Tourette's syndrome, which depends so much on impulse and interaction, sometimes of very strange sorts. You have to see it in real life, which is why at the moment my present work has taken me out of the clinic a bit to travelling the country with a friend of mine who has Tourette's, and sort of looking at the extraordinary Tourettic world, the sort of the strange fraternity of Touretters who seem to be scattered through the States. But certainly Tourette's can show one a very much broader spectrum of human nature, and in particular of what one might call the primitive in human nature, than some people feel comfortable with.
And at one time, the medical profession had virtually assumed that all of the cases had disappeared, even doubted the existence of the syndrome.
Yes, it was originally described a century ago by Gilles de la Tourette. There were a lot of cases described in the last century, and then around 1905 or so, these descriptions stopped. As a medical student and a resident, I'd scarcely heard of it. It was said to be extremely rare and almost non-existent. And I saw my first patient with it in 1971. The day after seeing him, I saw 3 people in the streets of New York with it. And the day after that, another 2. And this sort of blew my mind, because I thought, these people must have been there already. Was I seeing them or not seeing them? Was I seeing them and dismissing them as something else? I wondered if it could be 1,000 times commoner than I'd supposed. I wondered if these people might recognize one another and form a sort of fraternal association, a Tourette syndrome association.
An
underground. And precisely this happened. There was a Tourette syndrome association just 30 strong in 1974, and now it's 110,000 strong.
Well, it's as if maybe the syndrome has a cycle of activity, perhaps.
No. I think this is entirely to do with recognition. It's now perceived to exist. People can say it. They can come out into the open.
In the early part of the century, perhaps, the medical profession found this syndrome so uncomfortable they blinded themselves to it.
Well, it sort of transgresses the categories in many ways. On the one hand, it seems to be physical and motor. There are odd muscle contractions and twitches. And on the other hand, there can be cursing, there can be blasphemies, there can be sudden impulses to touch, and sometimes to hurt oneself. And it is such a mixture of the physical and the psychical that both neurologists and psychiatrists seem to be uncomfortable with it. And I mean, there's I once got a letter from a man who said he had a Touretteized soul, but I think there's almost nothing which can show one sort of the mutual influences of brain and mind as clearly as Tourette's. I mean, I love it for this reason, because it unites the categories, but when I think people often want to see them as separated, and one has to unite the categories of brain and soul.
Well, there's a sense, I suppose, in which one might think that these categories are artificial distinctions, that we're really dealing with one process, ultimately.
Well, we're certainly dealing with organisms, with living beings, and perhaps we have to have anatomical and physiological descriptions on the one hand, and psychical descriptions on the other. Perhaps one has to have two universes of description and discourse. But the question is then whether they can be bridged, whether they can come together.
Some of the work that you describe seems to defy not only the science of neurology, but even the more abstract disciplines of logic. Like you write about an incredible pair of twins who seem to have the ability to apprehend prime numbers, huge prime numbers, just in an instant, at a glance.
Well, I hesitated to publish this because it mystified me so much. But I'm no mathematician. I assume they must have a method. I confess that in that particular piece I did give way to some sort of Pythagorean mysticism or whatever, and I compared the twins to angels, immediately intuiting things. But I think whatever is intuited must have some sort of underlying method. But certainly I find astonishment, the feeling of astonishment and wonder are very much parts of parts of my daily work, and they need to be. I think one starts to be dead inside, and at least not to be open to things.
When we talk about the soul or spirit, it seems that we often come up against the notion of deviance and certain social pressure to reduce or to eliminate what we think of as deviance. I mean, in the case of these twins, their behavior, their mathematical communication with each other, where they would sit and almost in an ecstatic state recite prime numbers to each other, was considered very unhealthy, I gather, by the medical staff with whom they were working.
Yes, it was. And they didn't have very much other interaction. and they were separated for their own good. And they now each lead a sort of rather low-level, menial life. They're both mentally defective, but if they're given bus tokens and they can do simple things. Now they're not together. This extraordinary sort of communion seems to have ceased. Neither of them has a companion in this. It was a sort of heartbreaking thing with them, but again, I wouldn't want to generalize. Specifically, one can see identical twins who really lock each other up. There can be twin binds and twin bonds of a very destructive sort, and sometimes a separation is needed, at least for a while, in order that each twin can develop separately and then interact sort of autonomously.
I suspect the issue may be a larger one. I'm thinking of Carl Jung's book, for example, Modern Man in Search of a Soul, and he seemed to feel that there was something about our modern mechanistic way of building our culture, of viewing the world, that was depriving us of an appreciation for the really essential things in life. And I got much of that flavor in your writings as well.
Well, one sees again and again that there has to be meaning in life, otherwise it falls apart. This was especially clear and poignant with the awakenings patients, these post-encephalitic patients who'd been in these motionless, trance-like states for decades, and were then awakened and animated by L-DOPA, this drug which became available in the late 60s. Now, the first awakenings was a sort of physiological event and lyrical and wonderful. They were resurrected. The summer of '69 was extraordinary.
Almost as if they had been brought back from the dead.
Very much so. One of the patients jokingly called dopamine, this transmitter in the brain, he called it resurrectamine. And of course, these had been people who'd been out of the world for 30 or 40 years. It was all the fairy tales, the myths, Rip Van Winkle, Lazarus, whatever, came to mind. After this extraordinary festive summer of '69, all sorts of problems developed. Some of them physiological and some of them psychological. The psychological ones, perhaps especially because these people who had been dropouts, so to speak, from the world, didn't have a world to go back to, or the worlds which had meaning for them might be 40 years in the past. After this, a lot of them did very badly on L-DOPA and went into sort of strange cycles, unless it was possible to make a life, and a life, say, in Freud's terms, with a sufficiency of work and love, or just a sufficiency of meaning. And one saw how inadequate the physiological was by itself. It's not sufficient to have dopamine. And one of the patients put this in biblical terms and simply says, man does not live by L-DOPA alone. And he needs meaning, he needs love, he needs relationship. And but certainly one sees again and again with all sorts of physical and especially neurological disorders that meaning is needed to hold the person together. One would see, I saw this very beautifully and described it a bit with one man with a devastating memory problem called Korsakoff psychosis, in which he couldn't remember anything for more than a few seconds, and he was really completely lost for most of the time. But in the Mass, in communion, and sometimes in music, he was completely coherent, and together he wasn't incoherent, and he was completely restored as a man. I always thought of that beautiful description of D.H. Lawrence when he says, "Thought as a man in his wholeness, wholly attending." Now, in that wholeness of attention, Jimmy would become a man, a complete man. When he was outside this sort of thing, he would disintegrate because he had no memory. And one of my activities as a neurologist, as it were, the more conventional one, obviously, is physiologically determined. I'm looking for drugs and other methods which alter nervous activity. But the other half of me is very concerned with the power of art, religion, human contact, meditation, whatever.
And music.
And above all, music.
There was a sense in your tale of the man who mistook his wife for a hat, that it was the music that kept his life from totally disintegrating.
Oh, absolutely. This was a man with a rather rare problem of visual agnosia, which meant that he couldn't recognize anything he saw. He saw it perfectly clearly, but he couldn't give any meaning to it. And the only way so he couldn't recognize anyone.
And he literally mistook his wife's head for
yeah,
a hat.
At the end of the first interview, he went to get his hat, and he got her head instead. And and I thought, how could a man make such an error? But in a world which is visually meaningless, one can. But he had to give order to the world in a way by orchestrating it, by giving it a musical score, and by singing it, perhaps in somewhat the same way as we do when we have work songs and things like this, except it was much more elaborate. I first saw this sort of thing, and I continually see it, with people with Parkinson's disease. With severe Parkinsonism, you may not be able to walk, but you can dance. You may not be able to talk, but you can sing. And if music comes to one's aid. Now, I had one Parkinsonian patient, in fact, who used to be a music teacher, and she said she felt she had been unmusicked by Parkinsonism. She felt she had become mechanical and robotic and graceless in her movements, as indeed she had. But she needed to get her melody back, her living melody, and this was provided by music. I think in a way music, one needs all these mechanical concepts, but one also needs all these musical concepts. And since you use the word soul, my idea of the soul is that it's musical. Both people have always, Pythagoras and Plato, compared the soul, said the soul is harmonical, and I'm sure it is, and I think it's a melody as well. I have to think of the soul in musical terms.
There was another patient that you wrote about, a woman who I believe was severely retarded, and yet it was through drama and theater that she found her life.
Yeah, this is absolutely, one sees this again and again, and I think drama therapy is tremendously important. And a role which will give one completeness, again, can be perfectly possible to one, even if one is severely demented from Alzheimer's disease or severely retarded. And in a way, the integrity of the role gives one its own integrity, as the wholeness of the music gives one its own wholeness.
The word integrity seems quite important here when we refer to the soul. It seems that must be well, I think of two things when I think of the soul: the quality of integrity, the wholeness, but also the yearning that is there, the movement towards that the patients who you describe seem to express even at times when all others had given up hope. Sometimes they would have a violent outburst, and it was their way of somehow moving towards a wholeness.
Well, everyone needs to be a whole in the sort of ways which are possible for them. Now, another group of people who absorb me very much at the moment are the deaf, and certainly for those who are born deaf, it may be very difficult to acquire much in the way of speech. Lip reading may be difficult. But a completely visual communication, a sign language can be established. Paradoxically, the deaf who are least disabled in infancy are those who are the children of deaf parents, because their parents can communicate with them from the start. But sign language permits communication, but it also permits a whole culture and a whole form of being, which is somewhat different from what seeing people have,
Oh, yes.
and but no less valuable, no less interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I think the recent revolution at Gallaudet College, the College for the Deaf, was very much about this clamour for a deaf president, but really it was for what was a demand. It was really not a political demand, but a demand for recognition as a complete form of being.
Mm-hmm.
The deaf were saying, you know, don't just call us handicapped, but recognize that we are completely adapted in a different way,
Mm-hmm.
and we can, and we can do what we want. We can do anything as well as you can, except here.
Well, I got that sense from reading your book that, in a sense, this is even true of the retarded. That there's a wholeness to them in their own way, and a contribution which they make, which
Yes.
sometimes goes way beyond the capabilities of the so-called normal.
One finds again and again often that the parents of children with Down syndrome can be deeply attached to their children, and and feel
They can be extraordinarily loving.
yeah, and one can have every sort of disease, but and yet be complete as a human being, and and I certainly think that the sort of the sole function of the physician is to sort of respect this and try and help it.
Dr. Oliver Sacks, we're out of time now, but it's surely been a pleasure to be with you. I think that your work is very important in showing us, and also particularly in showing your colleagues in the medical professions, that there's so much depth to the human being beyond the clinical reports. There's such a value in, no matter how we define it, looking for the soul in each person. Thank you very much for being with me.
It's been a pleasure.
And thank you very much for being with us.